Hi, I'm Brittany of BZ Art, and I'm here to show you how to make my betta fish pattern. And just as a reminder, I do have 3 birds in the craft room, so they might make a little bit of background noise, as well as street noise in general, so please forgive it. I'm going to start with sewing the ventral fin. For my entire betta fish pattern, I recommend cutting it out on the exact sewing lines and tracing those. If you need the seam allowance, it is included in the pattern, but I find that it's more exact when you don't use it, just because 1/4 of an inch can obscure a lot of the detail in the pieces. So I tend to just trace on the exact sewing lines, and I actually just cut out in a square around it to make it easier for me to sew these small parts. And I even only just trace this one side and place it right side together and cut it out as one, so I don't need to trace twice. It just saves some time. So you're going to just start at the top here and sew all the way around. And then you're going to leave the top of the fin open to turn it right side out. So now I'm just going to clip off my excess seam allowance. And then I'm going to turn the fin right side out using a pair of hemostats. A lot of people have asked me what they are. They are a medical supply device. They use them during surgeries. I am not really 100% sure, but they have nice grips inside of them, and it's really good for turning small pieces. So you just poke it in, grab the ends, and pull it. Next, we're going to sew the other fin. I cannot remember what this one is called, please forgive me, but it is labeled in the pattern. Just like the other one, I just cut it out in a square and traced on the exact sewing line. So you're just going to sew around this and again leave the top open to turn it right side out. Trim the excess seam allowance. And then turn it. Again, I'm using my hemostats. Now we're going to sew the top detail lines in. On the pattern, I recommend you use an air-soluble marking pen. I am not, just because I've done this so many times that I know where to put the lines. So you're just going to, I start here on the end, I sew my way into the middle, and then I turn the piece and sew back out to the end. Make sure you're tying off on the ends. My machine does it automatically, but if you don't, it will unravel, which no one really wants. So I get this nice V shape, and then you just clip your extra thread. And then you'll repeat both of these steps to create the other halves. I'm going to take the side of the body and a gill piece. And you're going to place the gill onto the body and then pin it in place. You're going to take the head and you're going to align it. So this would be point A on my pattern, and this is point A on my head. And I'm going to start from the bottom just because of the direction I'm sewing this is easier for me, but it's the same either way. You just align the points, you sew a bit, and then turn this to continue sewing together this opposing curve. This can be kind of tricky for some people. But there are a lot of techniques to make this easier. You can trim the seam allowance to help these turn. I find that you don't really need to do that with fleece, it's very stretchy. You can pin it all the way around. You can baste it loosely by hand to keep them together. So whatever method works best for you. I just turn it as I sew. I'm going to clip this excess seam allowance. Clipping the excess seam allowance just helps the plushie lie flat and not wrinkle or pucker later down the line. So we've sewn the gill into place there. Next, we're going to make the cut here where it's marked on the pattern. And we're going to insert our fin. I like to put the longer side on top. I think that looks best. We just insert it through the hole, kind of fold it over it like that. And then we're going to sew from here to here. Don't sew down the whole body, you'll get a big long line and it won't look very nice. So just sew as close to the edge as you can. I'm going to double check to make sure that that's sewed entirely and there's nothing sticking out. And it is fine. So I've already done all of these steps with the other side of the body, but that's the next part, is to repeat that whole process. Now you're going to lay 2 ventral fins together like this, and you're going to lay them on place on one side of the fish and pin them there. Next, you're going to want to lay the other side of the fish on top of it and pin all the way around. I don't think that I put in my pattern that you should pin it, but it definitely makes it a lot easier if you do. So if you feel comfortable without pinning it, you can skip this step. And then your ventral fins should just stick out here, and this will be the opening where you leave your plushie open to turn it right side out. So I'm going to start right just before this head seam and start sewing around the entire plushie. Removing the pins as I go, just so that I don't accidentally hit them with the needle and break either the sewing needle or these pins. I've had that happen before. I've also had the sewing needle go through the head of a pin and get stuck, so it's just best to remove those and not sew over them when possible. When you get to these corners here, it's best not to sew a V like this. It can result in a pucker. So I tend to turn it, so just a couple stitches, and then turn it again, so you don't have the sharp angle like that. That's especially important on the crown tail version of this pattern, because there are a lot of little nooks and crannies like that, and it's very important that you sew more of a U shape and not a V. Same thing here, just a couple stitches over to the side. then you're going to finish up here and leave an opening about 2 or 3 fingers wide so that you can turn it and stop it. And in places like this are why I suggest tracing on the exact cutting lines, because if you traced on the seam allowance, you wouldn't have any of this information to tell you how far down to go. So now I'm just going to clip my excess seam allowance. I'm being careful between here so that I can clip as close to these lines as possible, but I don't want to cut my thread or get so close that it causes a hole when I turn it. There you go, it's all sewn around. Now this process up to this point and beyond basically is the same with all of the tail types. So I just have a veil tail here to show you. This again has potentially some very close areas here, so just be sure to be careful. Other than that, this is about the same. The crown tail pattern is one I really recommend tracing directly on the sewing lines, because again, this is a lot of information that gets lost in that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And especially places like this, it's very tight. So you want to make sure when you're cutting to just be very careful when you go through here. So, and again, I don't know if you can see here, but I don't do any V shapes. They're all light U shapes on all of these corners, again, just to prevent puckering. So now we're going to turn the fish right side out. And again, I'm just using my hemostats. Actually, I think I'm going to stop here and insert the safety eyes. I don't quite remember where I marked that on the pattern, but this is a good time to do that. Or really any point from here on out. You're pretty much fine to put the eyes in, they're not going to get in the way. So I'm just inserting them from the front side through this hole and latching the washer onto the back. And that washer prevents the eyes from falling out, which is what makes them safety eyes. I'm also going to clip the posts of these. Kind of shot across the room. This just helps the plushie lay a bit flat instead of having these posts pushing into each other potentially. And now I'm going to turn it right side out. With the crown tail, it helps especially to have a pair of hemostats so that you can get into all of those little tight spaces. And I'm just going to run my hemostats through and make sure all these fins are nice and flat. So the next step will be to sew the body. And again, you can use an air-soluble marking pen to mark this in place. I'm not going to, just because, again, I have done this enough that I know where to sew. you get to areas like this, you're going to sew as close as you can without actually sewing off of the fish. And now your fish has a nice little body. You can repeat kind of the same process. Use your air-soluble marking pen to mark the lines on the fish and then sew those. I like to start on that line, the body, and sew out. Once more, it's super important to tie these off with a couple stitches forward and back, otherwise your top sewing will unravel, and no one wants that. It's very sad. It doesn't matter too much if you're off by a little bit and the lines go over the seam of the body. Because fleece is so fluffy and because you're going to be stuffing it, you don't really see it much. And some people might prefer to sew from the edge in, and that's just fine too. And these lines don't have to be exact either. If you want to add more or less, it can look pretty cool. I've done this in cotton and I did swirls with a galaxy fabric, and that turned out great. Because the thread is showing, you can also choose to use a different color thread just for contrast purposes, and that can look pretty neat too. So now I've finished sewing all of my detailed lines in. I'm going to go ahead and clip all the extra threads. I'm just using a little pair of thread scissors. These are a lot easier than big scissors, less of a risk you're going to accidentally cut something you don't want. And you're going to want to cut these threads as close as you can get without cutting off the stitches that are holding it in place. So once you have all of your fin details sewn in, then you are almost ready. You just need to stuff your fish. And I just use regular polyfill stuffing. I take my hemostats and I take a big chunk of it and I stuff it in the fish. This is a very quick process just because the fish's body is so small. Most of the work in this plushie is in putting in the detail on the fins. You can also just use a chopstick to kind of shove the stuffing where it needs to go. That works just fine. And once you are satisfied with how your fish is stuffed, you are ready to close it up. Alright, so to close your fish shut, you're just going to use a ladder stitch. I start from the inside of the fish, going out, and you go across, and in, and back out again. Again, in, and out. This forms these lines across it that look like a ladder, which is where it gets its name from. And just every now and then you'll just pull it tight. At the very end here, I'm just going to push that stuffing back in with my hemostat so it doesn't get caught up in the seam. Pull it nice and tight one final time, and make a knot. And I am going to double knot this just because you can never be too safe. And you're going to stick the needle in, push it back out, pull, and then clip it as close as you can, and then when you let it go, it'll suck right back in the stuffing, and the end of your thread will be hidden. And then you have a beautiful betta fish.